Well, good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about gay men, which is to say men who have sex with other men. In German, schwule Männer. I'm going to make the case that gay men are victims of a hoax in which a non-existent disease is claimed to be caused by a virus which either does not exist or is harmless. On the basis of the AIDS hoax, hundreds of thousands of gay men in the United States alone have been killed by pharmaceutical poisons that were put on the market through fraudulent research. Someday, this will be known as the gay Holocaust. From the very beginning, gay men were identified with AIDS. And when I say AIDS, it's always in quotation marks. This was true even before AIDS had a name. Gay men were linked to the so-called epidemic through labeling. There were such words as the gay cancer, or gay-related immune deficiency, or a gay health crisis. Gay men would be targeted for testing and drugging, just as earlier gay men had been targeted for the marketing of poppers, or the nitrite inhalants, and other deadly recreational drugs. In time, AIDS would claim other victims: Haitians, hemophiliacs, intravenous drug users, and Africans. But AIDS never released its hold on gay men. At this very moment, perfectly healthy gay men are being goaded into taking these so-called HIV antibody tests. Those who test positive will be prescribed drug cocktails, which will make them sick and eventually kill them. It all began in 1981 when 5 men, all active homosexuals, were diagnosed as having pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or PCP, which was then falsely believed to be a rare disease caused by a protozoan. Shortly after this, a couple of dozen men, also active homosexuals, were diagnosed as having Kaposi's sarcoma, or KS, which was then falsely believed to be a rare form of cancer. The only common denominator was homosexual behavior. Public health officials falsely assumed that there must be a connection between these two radically different diseases, and they did their very best to find one or to invent one. One term that they bandied about was gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID, G-R-I-D. After gay leaders objected to GRID, it was changed to autoimmune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. It was hypothesized that the body might somehow be destroying its own immune system. When the public health officials realized that the autoimmune hypothesis was no good, but the acronym had caught on, they changed it to acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. Even nobody knew what was meant by acquired. All of these early assumptions were wrong. The PCP organism is now considered to be a fungus rather than a protozoan, and it is ubiquitous, present in the lungs of every human being in the world. Normally, it coexists peacefully with human hosts, causing illness only in those in desperately poor health. So how could PCP be rare? If someone in the past stopped breathing, an old man at the end of his life, or a heroin addict starving in a cold room, the diagnosis would be simply pneumonia or lung disease, without reference to a microorganism that had yet to be identified. Under the false assumption that Kaposi sarcoma was a cancer, most of the gay men with KS received cancer chemotherapy, which quickly killed them. It is now known and has been publicly admitted by public health officials that KS is not a cancer, it is not caused by HIV, and KS is not related to any kind of immune deficiency. At present, the only tenable hypothesis for the occurrence of KS in gay men is the use of poppers, or nitrite inhalants, the premier gay recreational drug. Entirely aside from AIDS, the medical literature on poppers indicates they are extremely hazardous to the health. And yet the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, in the early 1980s falsely assured gay men that poppers had no effect on the immune system. In effect, the CDC gave the green light for gay men to continue using poppers. And I might add, last night I went to a gay bar, and here behind the bar was a little sign that said, poppers, 12 euros. So they are quite openly and legally sold here in Vienna. Well before 1986, when the alleged AIDS virus acquired its official name, the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, three things were clear. Number one, AIDS was not a coherent disease entity, and the surveillance definition made no sense. It would be perfectly fair to say that, in a way, AIDS does not exist, except as a construct. Number two, whatever AIDS might be, it is not infectious. We've heard some of the arguments here. A strong argument was made in my first paper in 1985, and Caspar Schmidt made a similar argument in 1984. It is this: AIDS, whatever the diagnoses are based on, has remained rigidly compartmentalized. Month after month, year after year, it has stayed almost entirely in two main risk groups in the United States and Europe: gay men and intravenous drug users. And three, there were good reasons why the early AIDS cases were sick in the ways that they were. Science prefers the simplest explanation that accounts for the data. The principle was formulated by the 14th century philosopher William of Ockham. His razor states, "What can be done with fewer assumptions is done in vain with more." So let's apply Occam's razor to heroin addicts, who have been studied for well over a century. It is common knowledge that heroin addicts get pneumonia or lung disease. This is exactly what we would expect, since heroin and the other opiates specifically depress lung function, as well as wrecking the health in general. Using Occam's razor, we can say that heroin is causing heroin addicts to develop lung disease, just as it did 100 years ago. There is no need to look for a new infectious agent. So simple, except to public health officials. In New York City, heroin addicts with pneumonia are given alleged HIV antibody tests. If they test positive, then they have AIDS. If they test negative, they're just heroin addicts with lung disease. And yet the clinical profiles really are the same. In the case of gay men, there were also obvious reasons why the early AIDS cases were sick. Poppers and other recreational drugs, venereal diseases, antibiotics, and powerful psychological factors. At this point, I need to make a crucial distinction between the early AIDS cases and the later ones. In the first few years, those with AIDS diagnoses were very close to death. They didn't live long. However, in the last couple of decades, gay men with AIDS diagnoses or HIV-positive diagnoses may not even be sick. At least not sick until they get their diagnoses and start taking anti-HIV drugs. Their initial diagnoses may depend entirely on worthless T-cell or HIV antibody tests. It soon became clear that public health officials and emerging AIDS experts were not only incompetent, but also dishonest. They made blunders, but they also lied. My first AIDS article, published in February 1985, showed that the CDC issued statistics which deliberately covered up the connection between drugs and AIDS, and which falsely represented AIDS as an infectious venereal disease. The question then as now is whether the AIDS experts really believe what they say. If they really do believe what they say, then they are either incompetent or stupid. The CDC statistics indicate that in the United States alone, well over 1/3 gay men have died allegedly from AIDS. These men were not killed by a virus, but by drugs, poisons which were put on the market through fraudulent research and promoted through false advertising. Most of these gay men would be alive today if they had avoided the drugs and taken appropriate health measures. The gay Holocaust rests upon two pillars: superstition and profit. It must be seen in context, the historical persecution of gay men. It is a fact of life that human males are attracted to each other, sexually and otherwise. Sex between males was practiced enthusiastically in classical antiquity and in many societies around the world, but it has been ruthlessly suppressed in the West ever since the 4th century, when Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, bringing with it the Judaic taboo on sex between males. In the Holiness Code of Leviticus is stated, and I'll give the King James translation, "If a man lie with mankind as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them." That's Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. In the intervening centuries, gay men have been shamed and ostracized, imprisoned, tortured, pilloried, castrated, beaten or stoned to death, hanged and burned at the stake, all for violating a taboo, which is no more rational than the taboos on eating pork or wearing the wrong kind of clothing. Such persecutions do not belong entirely to the Dark Ages. The death penalty for male-to-male sex remained on the books in England until 1861, and in Scotland until 1887. In the mid-20th century, gay men in California were castrated and given electric shock treatment. In the 1970s and 1980s, gay men in the South African Army were given electric shock therapy and chemical castration. In the United States as a whole, sex between males only became legal 7 years ago. and there are still countries in the world where men are put to death for loving each other. Beginning in the 1970s, religious fundamentalists in the United States waged psychological warfare against gay men, telling them they were going to hell and should die. One such group, the American Party for Manhood, agitated to bring back the death penalty for sex between males. And the death penalty did return in the form of AIDS. Using documents obtained from the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, I demonstrated that AZT, also known as Retrovir or Zidovudine, was approved for marketing on the basis of fraudulent research. Blatant cheating took place in Boston, one of 12 test centers in the phase 2 AZT trials, the most important of all trials, intended to determine whether or not the drug was safe and effective. In Boston, patients who almost died from severe anemia caused by AZT, who required multiple transfusions to keep them alive, were reported by the Boston investigators, the criminal Boston investigators, as having no adverse reactions. The Boston investigators lied about the length of time subjects were in the trial, making it look as though they were in it much longer than they were. In one case, the Boston investigators illegally entered into the study a man who was already taking AZT. They assigned him to the placebo group, even though he continued to take AZT. And when he died a few months later, they counted him as a death in the placebo group, even though he had never stopped taking AZT. Cheating was also found in the other 11 test centers, but none of these were investigated thoroughly because the phase 2 trials were abruptly terminated. The FDA's stated reason for prematurely terminating the phase 2 trials was that AZT was miraculously extending the life of the patients, and it would be unethical not to put the drug on the market immediately. What a farce. The FDA knew very well that much and probably most of the phase 2 data were false. With this kind of ethics, the deliberate use of false data, AZT was put on the market, a poison without a single benefit. More than 96% of all so-called AIDS deaths in the US occurred after AZT was approved for marketing in 1987. These deaths were not caused by a virus, but by AZT and the other anti-HIV drugs. After AZT was approved, the FDA abandoned the double-blind, placebo-controlled trial as the gold standard for drug approval, claiming that it was forced to do so by AIDS activists. The AIDS activists being phonies who really represented big pharma. There was no longer even a pretense of basing drug approval on evidence. All of the later AIDS drugs, from nucleoside analogs to protease inhibitors, rode in on the coattails of AZT. How did gay men respond to the health crisis? At this point, the bitter truth, as I see it, is that there is no gay community. Gay publications have been brought into line, or gleichgeschaltet, with the AIDS industry. The New York native, which for over a decade provided a voice for AIDS critics, was destroyed through a boycott led by so-called AIDS activists. AIDS activists being phonies controlled by Big Pharma. To my knowledge, The Gay and Lesbian Humanist is now the only gay publication that is open to AIDS critics. It published my most recent article in defense of AIDS critics, which is now online. From the very beginning, many AIDS dissidents have been gay men, but other gay men unthinkingly supported the gay Holocaust. They trusted doctors. They responded masochistically with such things as candlelight vigils and the AIDS quilt, which reinforced a cult of victimhood. With good intentions, they encouraged their friends to take AIDS drugs that would kill them. And then there were still other gay men, like the late Martin Delaney, who were conscious and cold-blooded agents of Big Pharma. As many of you know, it is not easy to be an AIDS dissident. We have all taken hard knocks. Speaking for myself, I have not only received death threats and suffered financial losses, but I have been effectively ostracized from the gay liberation movement, to which I have devoted my life for over 40 years. The last time I spoke at a gay conference was a few months ago in Boston. I was a featured speaker, and I was discussing the goals of gay liberation. I simply happened to mention that I did not accept the HIV hypothesis. Immediately, people started yelling, "Shut up!" The conference organizers, who should have supported my right to speak, denounced me instead. To conclude myself, I'll describe two young men I have known, Jeremy and Kevin. They both did one of the hardest things that anyone can do, break a powerful addiction. Both were recovering alcoholics. Jeremy was a friend of mine. Sobriety was a new life for him. He was in good health. He made plans to return to college, and he began to be recognized for his writing. He wrote plays, and they were performed. He was put on AZT, and his health utterly collapsed. Then, under my influence, he stopped taking AZT. He regained his health, began riding his bike and exercising. He was again an athletic, attractive young man. Then one day he told me that his doctor had persuaded him to go on just a quarter dose of AZT, just a quarter dose. I said he already knew what I thought, that AZT is a poison with no benefits. I said to see what would happen, and that soon enough he would stop taking it. This was one of the worst mistakes of my life. A few months later, I read his obituary in the Village Voice. For Jeremy, even a quarter dose of AZT was fatal. And this is on my conscience. I should have been willing to fight for him. Now let me tell you about Kevin. Kevin is a rather independent young man. In creating a new life without alcohol or drugs, he took his health seriously, practiced yoga, ate well, and took nutritional supplements. Then he was persuaded to take the so-called HIV test, which came back positive. He was shocked, but determined to, quote, fight the virus, as he put it, by good health practices rather than by taking the drugs. Kevin read the book I gave him, The AIDS Cult. He told me he still believed he was infected with a virus. But at this point, he was still a robustly healthy young man. Unfortunately, he continued seeing a doctor who regularly tested for CD4 counts. At one point, the doctor told Kevin that he had almost no T cells. He was terrified and began taking the drugs. Now he has been on them for several months. He has acquired the look of a victim, scared and submissive. He has lost muscle tone. His arms are thinner. At the same time, he is bigger around the waist. Kevin refuses to discuss AIDS with me. One time he just said bluntly, "I don't want to talk about HIV." There are many gay men like Jeremy and Kevin who have broken their addiction to alcohol and drugs and are beginning to build new lives in sobriety. Then they take the HIV antibody test and get diagnosed as positive. Here I need to make an important point. Almost certainly, Jeremy and Kevin scored positive because of their past history of alcoholism and drug abuse. We know that several dozen conditions can cause positive readings on the ELISA and Western blot tests, and that alcoholism and drug abuse are among those conditions. However, many of the gay men who take the test now and are diagnosed HIV positive do not have a history of alcoholism or drug abuse. In any sample of the general population, a certain percentage will score positive for reasons unknown. If a great many gay men score positive, if a disproportionate number of HIV positive diagnoses are given to gay men, this is because for decades they have been targeted for testing. In contrast, the general population has never been targeted for testing, and very few straight people take the test. This week's edition of Bay Windows, Boston's weekly gay paper, has an ad by Project Truth. Quote, "It's fast and it's free. Rapid HIV testing. HIV results within 1 hour." Now, isn't that wonderful? Results that can wreck a life in only 1 hour. Since the tests have never been validated, there is no such thing as either a false positive or a true positive. Even among those who are HIV positive, no one has ever demonstrated true viremia, or viral infection, which would mean whole, cell-free viruses in the blood, a lot of them. Once these HIV positives begin taking the drugs, it's all downhill. First, malaise, then physical deformities, and finally, death. Many of them die before developing any of the 29 or so, quote, AIDS indicator diseases or conditions. These people are not counted as AIDS deaths, but rather deaths before diagnosis. I love that term, death before diagnosis. Meaning, of course, they were killed by the drugs before they had time to develop AIDS. All supporting the myth that AIDS deaths are dropping thanks to the new drugs. To close, there are no guilty victims of the AIDS hoax. None of them deserved what was done to them. Gay men deserved it no more than mothers or children or Africans or hemophiliacs. Whether conscious or not, the hatred of gay men, rooted in ancient superstition, is a part of the story. I remember my friend Caspar Schmidt referring to ACT as sadistic medicine, a fair statement. At some level of consciousness, doctors must have known what would happen for prescribing AZT. They must have known that this poison would kill their patients. I also remember William Hazeltine, a leading AIDS orthodoxer, who said that all gay men, including those who were HIV negative, should be given AZT as a prophylactic measure to prevent them from becoming infected. Now, what Hazeltine really meant was that all gay men should die. And now, the new generation of drugs, which have been so successfully promoted by big pharma's public relations firms. If doctors have eyes to see, they surely must observe that these drugs are making healthy patients sick. But even if we give doctors the benefit of the doubt, we should not forget that others in the AIDS industry committed their misdeeds knowingly and cold-bloodedly. The gay Holocaust and the greater AIDS Holocaust have gone on long enough. There have been enough victims. It's time to put an end to the AIDS hoax. And that is the end of my prepared talk. I have just a couple more comments I thought of later. I do have books for sale. They're out there, 4 of them. And if there's anything I hate, it's have to carry books back to Boston. The AIDS war is a great big one. That's good for analyses of AZT and also blow-by-blow descriptions of, AIDS critics versus orthodoxy in the early years. The one called The AIDS Cult is the only book that deals thoroughly with the psychological issues. And it has Caspar Schmidt's 1984 article, the very first one to challenge the idea that AIDS was caused by infectious agents. My last point is quite simple. I know a number of you deal with patients, probably gay men or people with AIDS diagnoses. And it's a very simple point. It's that the psychological factors absolutely have to be a part of treatment. It's necessary to understand whether or not a gay man with an AIDS diagnosis or a gay man with an HIV positive diagnosis is filled with guilt and shame because of this ancient taboo, whether a gay man with one of these diagnoses has a desire to live. And there's no simple answer to how does a physician or anyone else, give someone a desire to live. But nevertheless, it is certainly part of the pathology. I guess that's all I got to say.